The forest was alive with the gentle hum of the early morning, a symphony of chirping birds, the distant murmur of a flowing stream, and the rustling of leaves as a crisp breeze whispered through the towering pines. The golden rays of the rising sun stretched across the dense wilderness, painting the treetops with warm hues. Despite the breathtaking beauty of nature, an eerie stillness hung in the air, as if the entire forest was holding its breath, waiting for something unseen. A rugged 52-year-old wildlife conservationist moved carefully along a narrow dirt trail, his well-worn boots pressing softly into the earth. The weight of his camera rested against his chest, its strap digging into his shoulder, a familiar yet reassuring presence. His grizzled beard and weathered face bore the marks of years spent in these woods, studying, protecting, and documenting the creatures that called this place home. Solitude suited him. He had long since embraced the quiet companionship of the wilderness, but in this moment, a nagging feeling unsettled him. Something wasn't right. He paused at the edge of a small clearing, adjusting the strap of his backpack as his sharp eyes scanned the area. The usual chatter of birds had faded into silence. The wind had stilled. It was as if the very essence of the forest had recoiled into itself. His instincts, honed over decades in the wild, told him something was about to happen, something he might not be prepared for. A sound shattered the silence, piercing and desperate. A high-pitched yelp, followed by a raw, guttural cry, echoed through the trees. It wasn't the call of a bird or the startled cry of a deer. It was something bigger, something in distress. His pulse quickened. Without hesitation, he adjusted his pack and moved swiftly, weaving through the underbrush with practiced ease. His boots crushed damp leaves as he pushed deeper into the dense forest, his heart hammering against his ribs. He knew better than to rush into the unknown, but something about that cry pulled at him, gnawed at his instincts. Through the thick foliage, he spotted movement. In a small clearing just ahead, two tiny bear cubs, no older than a few months, were huddled against a fallen log. Their trembling bodies pressed tightly together, their soft golden brown fur fluffed up in fear. Wide, terrified eyes darted around, ears twitching at every sound. And then he saw why. A pack of 5 wolves had encircled them. Their lean, muscular bodies were tense, poised for the kill, their piercing eyes locked onto their prey, unwavering. At the front stood the alpha, a large, battle-worn male with thick, grey fur and piercing yellow eyes. His lips curled back in a silent snarl, saliva dripping from his sharp fangs. One of the cubs let out a pitiful cry, its tiny paws scraping at the log as if searching for an escape. But there was none. His breath hitched. Cubs this young should never be alone. Where was their mother? Had she been killed? Was she injured? His sharp gaze scanned the surrounding trees, but there was no sign of her. The only thing standing between these helpless cubs and certain death was fate, or him. One of the wolves took a slow, deliberate step forward. Its head lowered, its body coiled like a spring, ready to strike. The cubs whimpered and pressed even closer together, their tiny claws gripping the rough bark of the fallen log. They were powerless against what was coming. The conservationist knew he was witnessing a brutal truth of nature. Wolves had to eat. They were hunters, and these cubs were easy prey. He had spent years documenting the wild, vowing never to interfere, never to disrupt the delicate balance of nature. But how could he just stand there? His grip tightened on his camera, his every instinct screaming at him to do something. Anything. But what? The alpha wolf took another step. He was close now, too close. The moonlight caught the glint of his sharp teeth, bared in anticipation. And then, something remarkable happened. The older cub, trembling but determined, let out a sudden, desperate growl. It was tiny, almost laughable in comparison to the sheer power of the wolves. But it was a growl nonetheless, a declaration of defiance, a final act of bravery. It lunged forward, its little body barely making an impact, but the effort was undeniable. The alpha barely flinched. It was toying with them now, letting them feel the fear before the inevitable. A deep, primal anger surged through the conservationist. He had spent his life as an observer, a silent witness to the raw beauty and cruelty of nature. But this he could not simply watch. He had to act. But how? His rifle was slung across his back, but he wouldn't use it. He wouldn't kill. His mind raced. His heart pounded. He needed to create a distraction, and he needed to do it now. In one swift motion, he yanked the flare gun from his belt, cocked it, and fired it straight into the sky. A sharp crack split the air, followed by a brilliant explosion of red light. The trees around him glowed with the eerie, flickering hue, casting long, shifting shadows across the forest floor. The wolves' heads snapped upward, their ears flattening against their skulls, their bodies momentarily frozen by the sudden burst of sound and light. That split second of hesitation was all he needed. "Get out of here!" he roared, stepping out into the open. He threw his arms wide, making himself look bigger, his deep voice cutting through the clearing. His sudden movement, combined with the lingering flare, unsettled the pack. The wolves snarled in irritation, their bodies tense with indecision. They weren't cowards, but they weren't reckless either. The alpha, standing tall at the front, locked eyes with him. For a brief moment, the two stared at each other. One the ruler of the wild, the other an intruder. A silent battle of wills. Then, with a reluctant snarl, the alpha made his decision. One by one, the wolves turned and melted back into the forest, their shadows slipping between the trees like ghosts. And then, silence. The only sound left was the heavy, rapid breathing of the two bear cubs still huddled near the fallen log. Their small bodies trembled, their wide, frightened eyes darting between the trees, half expecting the wolves to return. But they were gone. The conservationist exhaled a shaky breath. His hands trembled slightly, the aftershock of adrenaline still surging through his veins. He had done it. He had saved them. But now, standing in the middle of the silent clearing, another realization hit him like a punch to the gut. What was he supposed to do with two orphaned bear cubs? The wild was still just as dangerous as before. If their mother was truly gone, they wouldn't last long on their own. He had already broken one of the most sacred rules of wildlife conservation, interfering with nature's course. Was he really about to do it again? The first light of dawn was beginning to filter through the trees, painting the forest in soft golds and blues. Yet the weight in his chest only grew heavier. The cubs hadn't moved, their tiny bodies still pressed against the log as if it could somehow shield them. Their fur was ruffled, their breathing uneven. They weren't just scared, they were waiting. Waiting for something, for someone, their mother. But she wasn't coming. He stood frozen, his chest still rising and falling with the remnants of adrenaline. His instincts screamed at him to walk away. He was a conservationist, not a savior. He wasn't supposed to get involved beyond observation. Maybe their mother would return. Maybe they would find a way to survive. But deep down, he knew the truth. They wouldn't make it. Without their mother, they had no protection, no way to find food. If the wolves didn't return, something else would. And if predators didn't get them, starvation or exposure would. He clenched his jaw, his hands tightening into fists. A small whimper broke the silence. The larger cub, the braver of the two, lifted its head just slightly, its tiny body trembling. It let out another soft, helpless cry, its dark eyes darting around, ears twitching, listening for a response that would never come. The conservationist felt something tighten in his chest. He had a choice to make. If he walked away, he was sentencing them to death. If he took them in, he was risking not only their safety, but his own. Bears, especially cubs, were unpredictable. They weren't pets. They were wild animals. And yet, after everything that had just happened, after seeing the terror in their eyes, how could he turn his back on them now? He let out a deep sigh, running a rough hand over his grizzled beard. There was only one real option. Gritting his teeth, he adjusted his backpack and took a careful step forward. The cubs flinched, shrinking back against the log. Their tiny bodies pressed so close together, they almost looked like one. Their mother had likely taught them to fear humans. Smart. But right now, fear wouldn't help them survive. He crouched down, moving slowly, and spoke in a low, steady voice. "Hey there, little ones," he murmured. "I know you're scared." The smaller cub let out a soft, frightened squeak, pressing its tiny paws into the dirt. "I won't hurt you, I promise." His tone was gentle, the same way he had spoken to countless injured animals before. These cubs weren't just physically vulnerable, they were emotionally shattered. The larger cub, still braver than its sibling, lifted its head slightly and sniffed the air. Slowly, carefully, the conservationist reached into his pack and pulled out a granola bar. Not exactly bear food, but it was something. He unwrapped it, broke off a small piece, and set it on the ground between them. The cubs stared at him, hesitant, suspicious. For a moment, he thought they wouldn't take it. Then, slowly, the larger cub stretched its neck forward, nostrils flaring at the scent of food. A few more seconds passed. And then, the forest was alive, with the soft whispers of early morning, birds chirping their first songs of the day, the gentle rustling of leaves as a light breeze passed through, and the distant murmur of a stream winding its way through the underbrush. The towering pines stretched endlessly towards the sky, their tips bathed in the first golden rays of sunlight filtering through the dense canopy. It was the kind of morning that felt almost untouched by time, as if the world had been this way forever. Yet despite the beauty of the wilderness, something felt off. There was an eerie stillness beneath the usual morning melody, a weight in the air that didn't belong. The kind of silence that sent a warning straight to the gut of anyone who had spent enough years in the wild. A rugged, 52-year-old wildlife conservationist moved carefully along a narrow dirt trail, his boots pressing softly against the damp earth. The weight of his camera hung heavy against his chest, its strap digging into his shoulder. His weathered face, lined from years of exposure to the harsh elements, was framed by a grizzled beard, and his sharp, observant eyes scanned the trees ahead. He had spent decades in these woods, studying, documenting, and in many ways, protecting the creatures that called this place home. Few people knew his name. Even fewer had ever seen him in person. And that was exactly how he preferred it. Solitude suited him. Out here, there was no noise from the modern world, no endless hum of technology, no crowds, no distractions. Just him, the land, and its inhabitants. But today, something was different. Something he couldn't quite put his finger on. Pausing at the edge of a clearing, he adjusted the strap of his backpack and took a deep breath, trying to place the source of his unease. Then it hit him. The birds had gone silent. The usual chorus of chirps and rustling had vanished, replaced by a suffocating hush that coiled around him like an unseen force. His instincts sharpened, every fiber of his being telling him that something was wrong. Deep within the forest, something was happening, something he wasn't prepared for. Then a sound shattered the silence. A high-pitched yelp, raw and desperate, echoed through the trees. It wasn't a bird. It wasn't a deer. It was something bigger, something in distress. His pulse quickened. His fingers tightened around his camera strap as his mind raced through the possibilities. He had spent years learning the sounds of the wild, understanding their meanings, and this particular cry sent a chill down his spine. It came again, frantic, pleading. Without hesitation, he adjusted his backpack and broke into a swift, controlled walk, navigating through the thick underbrush with the precision of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. His boots crushed damp leaves beneath him as he moved deeper into the dense forest, his heart pounding against his ribs. He knew better than to rush blindly into an unknown situation. But something about that cry gnawed at his soul. And then, through the thick foliage, he saw them. In a small clearing just ahead, two tiny bear cubs, no older than a few months, were backed up against a fallen log, their trembling bodies pressed close together. Their golden brown fur was fluffed up, making them look even smaller than they were. Their wide, frightened eyes darted between the trees, their small ears twitching at every sound. And then he saw why they were so terrified. A pack of 5 wolves had encircled them. The lean, muscular predators moved with eerie precision, their bodies tense, their eyes locked onto their prey. At the front of the pack stood the alpha, a large, imposing wolf with thick grey fur and piercing yellow eyes. His lips curled back. In a silent snarl, his predatory gaze fixed on the helpless cubs. The cubs let out another pitiful cry, one of them clawing at the fallen log as if searching for an escape. But there was none. The conservationist's breath hitched. His mind raced through the possibilities. Cubs this young should never be alone. Where was their mother? Had she been killed? Injured? He scanned the area, hoping to catch sight of her massive form charging through the trees to protect her young. But there was nothing. No movement, no sound. Just the tightening circle of wolves and the hopelessly vulnerable cubs. One of the wolves took a cautious step forward, head lowered, body poised to strike. The cubs whimpered, pressing even closer together, their tiny claws digging into the rough bark of the log. The conservationist knew he was witnessing a brutal moment of nature. Wolves had to eat. They were hunters. And these cubs were easy prey. If he intervened, he would be disrupting the balance of the wild, something he had sworn never to do. And yet, how could he just stand there? His grip tightened around his camera, his every instinct screaming at him to act, to do something. But what? This was the law of nature. The wolves weren't being cruel. They were surviving. And yet, another step. The lead wolf was close now, saliva dripping from its fangs. The older cub let out a sudden, desperate growl, tiny but filled with the kind of bravery only the helpless could summon. It lunged forward in a pathetic attempt to fight. The wolf barely flinched. It was toying with them now, letting them feel the fear before the inevitable. A deep, primal anger surged through the conservationist. He had spent years photographing nature, documenting the wild, telling himself he was just an observer. But this wasn't something he could just watch. He had to act. But how? His rifle was slung across his back, but he wouldn't use it. He wouldn't kill. His mind raced, calculating his next move. He needed to create a distraction. And then instinct took over. With one swift movement, he yanked his flare gun from his belt, cocked it, and fired it straight into the air. A deafening bang exploded through the trees, followed by a brilliant flash of red light. The wolves startled, their heads snapping upward, ears flattening against their skulls as the bright flare illuminated the clearing. For a second, just a single second, they hesitated. And that was all he needed. "Get out of here!" he roared, stepping into the open, swinging his arms wide to make himself look larger. His voice boomed through the trees, deep and commanding. The wolves, spooked by the explosion and his sudden movement, growled in irritation, but backed away. They weren't cowards, but they weren't foolish either. The alpha's yellow eyes locked onto him, filled with caution and challenge. For a brief moment, man and beast stared at each other, two forces of nature standing off. And then, with a reluctant snarl, the alpha turned. One by one, the wolves retreated into the trees, their lean forms vanishing into the shadows like ghosts. Silence. The only sound left was the rapid breathing of the cubs, their tiny bodies still trembling from their near-death encounter. The conservationist let out a shaky breath. His pulse still thundered in his ears, his hands trembling from the rush of adrenaline. He had done it. He had saved them. But now came the real question. What was he supposed to do with 2 orphaned bear cubs? The wilderness was still dangerous. If their mother was truly gone, they wouldn't survive long on their own. He had broken the rules of nature once already. Would he be willing to do it again? As the first light of dawn filtered through the trees, he knew one thing for certain. This wasn't over yet. A single deep whimper came from the small bundle in his arms, a pitiful sound that curled into his chest and tightened around his heart, like a vice. The conservationist barely dared to breathe. His body remained frozen, every muscle locked in place as his mind scrambled to process what was happening. The musky scent in the air had grown stronger, thick with damp earth and something primal. His instincts, sharpened by years spent in the wild, screamed at him even before his mind fully caught up. It wasn't just any bear. It was their mother. The realization crashed into him like a wave, sending a jolt of adrenaline through his veins. The labored breathing he had heard wasn't just the wind shifting through the trees. It was her, wounded, exhausted, yet still standing. And now she was here. The cubs must have sensed it too. Their tiny bodies, once trembling from fear of the wolves, now seemed to quiver with something else. A recognition, a longing. One of them let out a tiny, uncertain whimper. Then, through the thick underbrush, a massive figure emerged. The grizzly bear was enormous, even in her weakened state. Her fur, once thick and majestic, was matted with dirt and streaked with blood. A fresh wound stretched across her shoulder, raw and angry, likely the result of a fight. Whether it had been with another bear, a predator, or even the wolves that had threatened her cubs, he didn't know. But she was here now, standing before him. Her dark eyes locked onto him with an intensity that made his stomach twist. She was exhausted. That much was clear. But in her eyes, there was something more than just weariness. Something primal, protective, dangerous. She took a slow step forward. The conservationist felt his pulse pounding in his ears. He had survived the wolves. He had carried these cubs. Very, very slowly, he crouched down. Every movement was deliberate, calculated, designed to show her that he was no threat. His hands trembled slightly as he loosened the jacket wrapped around the cubs. Another whimper came from the smaller one, hesitant, unsure. The mother bear let out a sound, low, rumbling, vibrating through the ground beneath him. It wasn't a growl. It wasn't a roar. It was something else entirely. A call. The larger cub moved first. Cautiously, it wriggled free from the folds of fabric and took an unsteady step forward. The mother bear remained still, watching, waiting. Then, the smaller cub followed. It was tentative, moving with hesitation, as if uncertain whether it could truly believe what was in front of it. Then, just as its tiny paws pressed into the damp earth, it let out a soft, pitiful cry. That changed everything. The mother bear moved. She surged forward, not in attack, but in sheer desperation. For a brief second, the conservationist's muscles coiled, instinct telling him to flee, but there was no need. She wasn't coming for him. She was coming for them. The cubs let out tiny, eager whimpers as they were scooped up into her massive embrace. The mother bear buried her snout into their fur, nuzzling them, sniffing them all over as if making sure they were real. They clung to her, their small bodies pressing into her warmth, their cries turning into soft murmurs of comfort. The conservationist swallowed hard, his chest tightening at the sight. Against all odds, they had found their way back to each other. Then, the moment changed. The mother bear lifted her massive head, her dark eyes locking onto him once again. For one terrifying second, he thought this was it. She was going to attack. He had touched her cubs. He had interfered. Surely she wouldn't let that go unanswered. But then, something incredible happened. Her expression softened. Her breathing steadied, her muscles relaxed. And then, in a slow, deliberate motion, she dipped her head. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but he understood it immediately. In the wild, gestures spoke louder than words. She was acknowledging him, not as a threat, not as an enemy, but as something else. His throat felt tight. He had spent his entire life studying wildlife, believing himself to be an outsider looking in. But at this moment, he wasn't just observing nature, he was a part of it. The mother bear let out one last deep breath. Then, with her cubs safely nestled against her, she turned and disappeared into the trees. The conservationist didn't move. He just stood there, watching, as the forest swallowed them whole. And then, for the first time in what felt like hours, he exhaled. His body was exhausted. His hands shook, but his soul felt lighter. As he made his way back through the forest, the adrenaline slowly faded, replaced by a quiet sense of peace. He had set out that morning as a witness to nature. He had planned to take pictures, to document, to observe from afar. But nature had pulled him in, and in doing so, it had changed him. Some stories weren't meant to be told through a lens. Some stories, like this one, were meant to be felt. Deep in the heart, where words failed. As he stepped onto the porch of his cabin, he paused, glancing back at the endless stretch of wilderness behind him. Somewhere out there, a mother and her cubs were safe, and that was enough. If this incredible story of survival and compassion moved you, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more powerful wildlife rescue stories. Every video brings you closer to the untamed beauty of nature, highlighting real moments of struggle, bravery, and the deep connections between humans and animals. By subscribing, liking, and sharing, you help us continue bringing these inspiring stories to life. Your engagement allows us to spread awareness about the challenges wildlife faces and the importance of conservation efforts. Our channel is dedicated to showcasing authentic and heartwarming moments, stories that remind us of the raw, untamed spirit of nature and the silent bonds we share with the wild. Hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an incredible rescue story. Together, we can create a world where every animal's story is heard and appreciated.